Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Season 3 is almost here, and I've gone through each of the dungeons for the pool. I want to talk about what the dangers are going to be for next season, the dispel profiles, the healing profiles, and what is going to be killing you and your teammates to watch out for. The big thing I noticed with this dungeon pool is it's not that heavy on curses and poisons, but it's really the curses that I think stand out in just one of the dungeons in Halls of Atonement. When it comes to dispels, it's not as brutal as it's been in the past. But there are some dungeons that are extremely overtuned and some that are actually really undertuned and feel like I barely need to be there as a healer. So let's dive into it, starting with Ecodome Aldani. And this dungeon is very cool with very fun boss fights and also some really deadly trash mobs. Still kind of the same vibe as like Sepulchre with some of those like harvesters that are sucking up like the void energy around. But what this really results in is trash pulls with huge amounts of AoE damage pretty much everywhere, almost every single pull. The very beginning of the dungeon is going to feature kind of like a martyrdom dot. When the ads are dying, they're putting up a huge dot onto your team. So you need to make sure that you're readying your healing cooldowns after the pull is over, or if you're chaining pulls together, you're going to need to have some constant output as you go from one pack to another. And then when you start going to both the first and second boss fights, there's a tremendous amount of spot healing required. Most of the damage that's going to actually kill you on those two boss fights is prio target healing. The first boss is putting up 2 dots onto players when they drop off some puddles. The second boss is going to feature spears that are rooting and sort of tethering players into place. And while they're still under the effect of the spear, they take ramping damage. So you're going to need a lot of extra damage to help break them out. But you're also going to need to make sure you have a lot of single target healing to deal with that incoming effect. Now the trash, like I mentioned before, has some martyrdom effects, but there's also a lot of mechs after the first boss. And they put up this little shield onto themselves before you pull them. When you crack that shield, then they start like leaking and radiating energy, both dropping magic void zones at your feet and doing absurd amounts of damage. This is probably going to have to get nerfed going into the season because you have to move and mash healing like crazy all the time. And most of the trash pulls when you're fighting the mechs are kind of like assassins that are going to jump behind players and deal this unavoidable damage, or jump on top of players and deal some splash damage. So you're encouraged to spread, deal with the splash damage, and the more you spread, the more surface area you take up because of the mech, and the more movement that you have to do to move out of all of these puddles. It gets really chaotic really quickly throughout this dungeon. And interestingly enough, each zone, or each time you kill one of the bosses, you kind of enter a different zone with a really different makeup of trash mobs. It's almost never like the same mobs that you're fighting all of the time. At the beginning, you kind of fight some of these like void harvester monsters, then you're fighting some of the ethereal, and then at the end you're kind of just fighting a mix of ethereal and bugs. And the bugs actually you can kill pretty quickly. We did a couple different pulls where we were able to like kite around all these bugs all over the place and have them just be zombie mobs. Basically, they weren't really like doing anything. They did a couple tank busters that put up a healing absorb on the tank, but if the tank could just kite them forever around some of the structures in the ruins, it made it ridiculously easy. There also are a couple different prio targets that DPS have to swap to like kill off some of the pylons or like shields that come up so that you can actually damage the main elite mobs. Those weren't too difficult to kill off as long as everything is in range. They kind of got cleaved down very quickly. But the last boss I'm a huge fan of because it basically shatters your soul, so you can kind of see your character get shattered throughout the fight, and you need to go run and pick it up at a couple different points. If you pick it up, you're getting a damage buff, but if you do not pick it up, you get a crazy dot, a big haste down, and I believe also a damage down on top of it. So it's insanely brutal if you do not pick up your soul, and I'm a massive fan of these type of mechanics. Unfortunately, it also puts up a huge dot, so you might just have somebody not collect their soul, die to the dot, and be like, why? What happened, healer? When it's gonna take a lot for people to survive the first time they kind of go into that. So be ready on that one. Ara-Kara returning once again for Season 3. If you played in Season 1, you'll know this dungeon was all about really heavy AoE, particularly on the first boss with the eggs cracking open and new spiders awakening, the room filling up with webs, and all the nasty that is going to ensue there. That still holds true, but they've made the poisons really, really deadly at the beginning of the dungeon. The ones on the final boss, however, they've actually ended up nerfing. So your trash is going to be quite a bit harder. The boss fight gets a little bit easier at the end, but if you've played in Season 1, it's still a mess of chaos, making sure you root yourself, avoid the suck-in, and the resulting explosion. They've also made a couple of key changes throughout this instance. The beetles, the big swarm guards, they still reduce the damage taken by the group after you kill the first boss, but now, instead of doing frontals, they actually do mass AoE events. And so a huge amount of trash after that first boss is dealing a crazy amount of AoE damage constantly, and there's only so many of these swarm guards that you're able to skip, so you're still gonna have to fight quite a few. If you add that on top of the really large amount of party-wide damage heading towards the first boss and heading towards the final boss, this is one of the most consistent high AoE damage dungeons in the pool. Now, there are some bright sides to it. It feels a little bit lighter when it comes to casters compared to some of your other options in the dungeon pool, and it also feels like an area where healer damage can really shine. Since there's a lot of predictable mass AoE events that are easier to defensive, it makes it a lot easier for healer damage to particularly shine. And throughout my testing, I was actually using quite a bit of Voidweaver Disc going through this dungeon, and it felt like I was not running into any big problems because I constantly just had big AoE healing. And I think you could actually get away with having Voidweaver Disc be the optimal option for pushing in high keys instead of the Oracle subspec, because most of the dungeon, second boss notwithstanding, most of the dungeon is just mass AoE damage events. And when you get to the second boss, well, you've got Pain Sup, you got Barrier, you got Defensives. The spot healing isn't as deadly as you might see in some of the other dungeons. So Ara-Kara, I think, is similar to where we were in Season 1, but the poisons are definitely overtuned, and I hope that they tweak it down a little bit on trash so it's not as frustrating when you don't have like Shaman around for poison dispels. Dawnbreaker also got a couple minor tweaks to the dungeon, some little tuning on boss fights that make the dot feel a little bit harder on the first boss that you have to end up dealing with. But they've also made a really big change to the dungeon where the shadows that you're fighting around the church, the cathedral type area, they used to do this mass AoE event that you have to plan for and watch their mana and make sure you were ready to blast tons of output. They've completely removed that ability going into the next season. That said, there is still a lot of dot damage. There's a lot of casters in here, especially ones that are sort of radiating party damage, decent amount of bolts going on, and a lot of tank pressure that has to be dealt with. In addition to this, you can dispel the tanks to start removing some of their increased stacking debuffs. Same thing goes for Ara-Kara as well. I neglected to mention, you have like the stacking slow at the end of Ara-Kara that used to be undispellable. Now you can just use a magic dispel for it. Same thing was going on in Dawnbreaker with some of the heal downs. There's still more stacking dots and healing downs going out onto tanks, so it doesn't look like it's getting any friendlier for our tank players. There's a lot of dot damage when you're fighting mini bosses, but most of the bosses in Dawnbreaker are mass AoE. There's another area where I think that like Voidweaver Disc could get away with playing it at higher levels even, because there are really big pulls for a lot of trash density where the Entropic Rift would shine, but there's also not as many areas where you need a lot of focused single target healing, which would like prevent a spec like Voidweaver from shining. For all the other healers as well, I think it's important to note that the curses in this dungeon themselves are not super deadly. They weren't really dealing tremendous amounts of damage, and a lot of the pulls that you're having, you're putting a lot of emphasis on some of the crowd control for like the bolts, the Tormenting Blast. There still is like the Stygian Seed, like magic debuff that goes out that's really deadly as well. And you do have to have a lot of mass burst AoE regardless of what healer that you're playing. Anubikaj is still an incredibly challenging boss, and the final boss as well is also just super high damage, similar to what we saw out of Season 1. They haven't made some big changes onto those ones. The boss fights are still really deadly, and they've only made a couple little tweaks to the trash. Floodgate is making a return from Season 2, and I'm really glad to see it. I think this is one of my favorite dungeons of the expansion thus far. There's a really good mix of damage patterns throughout the dungeon. Big Mama giving you some like burst AoE and damage vulnerability windows. Swamp Face giving you rot style encounters, which is ticking down for players with a couple bits of burst here and there to add a threat. And then you have the final boss, which is having both spot healing moments and burst AoE moments that you have to prepare for. It's a lot of different ways to challenge a healer, and I personally really enjoy that. They've done a little bit of tuning throughout the dungeon, but it doesn't feel super noticeable or super different really from what we saw out of Season 2. You still have to deal with like the Shredders, for example. They still deal a good amount of damage. There's still quite a bit of caster mobs throughout the dungeon that are going to need some of those prio kicks. They did reposition some mobs, namely the Blood Shaper that is by Big Mama no longer exists, so you can kind of just walk up, grab a bunch of extra trash, pull it into Big Mama, have a great time, and not have to worry about having that like pixel skip to make sure you're breaking out the canister and setting the bombs and everything while skipping the Blood Panda, Blood Shaper guy. You don't have to worry about that anymore, which is great, but you do still have to fight the one at the top of the stairs, kind of overlooking the dam before you fight Swamp Face. Speaking of Swamp Face, he honestly just kills poor Bubbles. We'll have a moment of silence for poor Bubbles. But oh my god, I'm so glad, because it means that the skip after Swamp Face doesn't exist anymore. You don't brick your keys to missing that skip anymore whatsoever. Hallelujah. Feels freaking great. Floodgate's probably one of my favorite dungeons, I think, like I said, of the expansion. Glad to see it returning, and I'm glad that they are not making it more frustrating in any ways. What does get a little bit more frustrating is the return of Priory. Now, they wanted to encourage some more like right side routing, and to do so, that means that you're pulling Tanner from high school in with the first boss. And Tanner is the one who's doing like firestorms, and he would cast a Cinder Blast where you would dispel the tank so that they don't get stunned, all those kind of things. Well, they removed the Cinder Blast, and they made it so that the firestorm would not cast while the boss is doing his leap onto somebody and munching them. But they also changed the boss so that instead of throwing this like thin red line spear, he's throwing this Earthshaker spear that creates earthquakes on the ground. That also deals a lot of AoE damage, which can be really nasty if you're doing a left side route, because when you do a left side route, you have to fight the priest mob who's casting Holy Radiance and doing mass AoE. So what happens is she's doing her usual mass AoE, and instead of having the boss leap on somebody, and they've removed that combo, the boss will instead throw these Earthshaker spears and do mass AoE damage. So they kind of traded off one combo of mechanics for another, and it's something you still have to watch out for. We'll see if some of the PTR tuning is going to fix that, but that was like one of the first things that I bug reported and first things that I noticed throughout. Also, they only made the knights slightly easier to fight by reducing their dot damage, which I get it because you don't want somebody to die to the dot when his mass AoE shout goes out, but I feel like the mass AoE shout when you are pulling it with like hunters that are doing, you know, uninterruptible shots. There's a lot of casters with their bolts and fireballs and smites, all of that other stuff. It's really irritating to have a huge mass AoE event and surprisingly no dot damage. You know, they changed Ara-Kara, for example, to have more dot damage, which feels pretty good when you're fighting a whole bunch of caster mobs, because you can have people around 100%, they'll be 90-95%. And so when you're doing your 10s and 12s, someone's not going to get one shot when the damage is going out and a bolt goes off. If you are preparing for healing, you'll usually be able to reverse that damage. But when you go to a dungeon like Priory, it's a huge mass damage event, and if somebody doesn't defensive it, they almost certainly will die from the AoE going off, plus a bolt or a hunter shot or something like that going out onto a player. Really super frustrating. What's more frustrating is they haven't done anything whatsoever to these paladin pools, and they also haven't changed the kamikaze explosion out of some of the risen dead at the end of the dungeon. So you still have two major sticking points for bricking your keys, being mass AoE that you can't do a great job preparing for unless you're in a really well-coordinated team, which is a fraction of this community, and there's no rot whatsoever. It's very strange. I think this dungeon would benefit massively from repurposing some of their mass damage effects to be a little bit lighter up front so people have some time to react, to respond. It's by far the burstiest dungeon we've seen of PTR testing, and a lot of different sticking areas that are frustrating, and you can just kind of die in a heartbeat, which is something I do not love at all. What I do feel a little conflicted about is Halls of Atonement returning. Now, I initially was super excited because it's a huge mass damage dungeon. There's a lot of AoE pulls. There's a lot of big trash mobs. But oh my god, this is probably the hardest dungeon in the pool. And I thought it was going to be Priory until I did Halls. Now, they've changed some of the mobs. So they're stacking up a debuff on the tanks, reducing their armor, while you're fighting Gorgon bears that put up really nasty bleeds, which are just as nasty as they used to be in Shadowlands. And at the same time, you're fighting the Shard of Halkias, and you're fighting a Collector, which puts up another magical effect that you want to dispel as well. This one has like this reddish void effect that gets placed on a player. It's a dot, and the damage that's dealt to the player heals the Collector. So the Collector is going to really take a long time to die if you're not dispelling that and you're dispelling the tank instead. And also, you could have somebody get that Collector dot and get the curse from the, I think it's the Obliterator mobs, which when it expires just does a huge amount of damage and cleaves anybody nearby. So there's way too many dispels in this dungeon. It's actually ridiculous how many dispels there are in the dungeon. And I haven't even gotten to the most insane parts yet either. It's the third boss where it has like the ghosts come down from the ceiling and you gotta like feed them into these canisters to make them go away. They added dots to that boss too for some strange reason. And so those dots, they don't ramp up in damage, but they still deal a ton. When the ghosts come out, they deal a ton of damage as well. And so you have a ghost come down, 2 players have dots, you have to choose which one to dispel and the other one which to spam heal, while mass spam healing everybody else. And they come out so frequently, the dots and the ghosts, that you are dispelling every 8 seconds on PTR right now, no matter what. And within every 8-second window, you're also just spamming AoE healing. And if the tanks, because they don't die to anything, or want to have fun, they also pull trash onto bosses, and that trash will include Collectors with that dot I just told you about. So, I'm dispelling like 20-something times on a boss fight, fighting for everyone's lives, and it's certainly a boss fight. It's certainly a boss fight onto that one. The final boss, they made, I guess, better, more interesting, kind of the same. They've just added more visuals, more like swirlies to run out of. It makes it feel like there's more happening on the boss fight, but there really isn't. You dodge the statues, you make sure you soak the statues when he draws them into himself, and you basically just avoid frontals, avoid things that are gonna kill you. It's a pretty straightforward fight, and there's certain pieces of this dungeon that I just cannot fathom why they made changes to it. When they make like the third boss as insanely hard as they possibly can for the healer. And then the fourth boss, it's kind of like they put on a fresh coat of paint of like, oh, look, stuff's happening. But in reality, it's just like a facelift, and the regular mechanics are kind of the same. First boss, the Halkias fight, feels pretty similar. I swear it's like a Mandela effect. I don't remember the swirlies going back and forth from Shadowlands, but everybody else seemed to, so I was not prepared the first time that happened to me. Whoa, what the... But watch out, because the spinning laser beams are going to turn around on you periodically, so be ready for that. To wrap us up, we've got both Tazavesh dungeons for the dungeon pool. On Streets, this one's super interesting because Streets was really not a super high damage instance back in Shadowlands when they had it around, Season 3, Season 4, and it kind of still goes along that trend. A lot of the trash pulls are pretty low damage. There's a number of like low damage dots that'll like slow you. So classes that have Tiger's Lust, Freedom, Phantasm, anything that can remove snare effects, which are slow effects, not roots, but slows, they were able to remove these dot effects, these magical dot effects. So the dispel profile wasn't super brutal or anything along those lines. You will have quite a few moments with some of the bosses kind of like teaching people the mechanics once again. I really think about the Postmaster boss as one that everyone's going to have to get a little bit of experience with, both soaking the puddles, getting dispels for the puddles, soaking the big AoE, running the bomb suitcases into the chutes and getting those away. That'll take a couple pulls as people kind of get used to the mechanics, but that's something I very much expect. The mobs that are sort of surrounding the inner courtyard before you fight Soza, the final boss, those ones are still pretty nasty, and they still do a really high damage charge where they're going to charge out to a ranged player and you basically just punch them, and it does a lot of damage. The best way to mitigate that is actually just to stack in melee. So regardless of your composition, you are just going to want to stack in melee when you have some of those elites that are charging at you in the courtyard. And By doing that, it actually feels like there's super insanely low damage. They changed the trading game, the barter game, to enter the club, and it made it feel like a little bit faster, which is always nice. They spawn ads more regularly and more consistently as you're doing the barter game, and it feels really, really quick. Still kind of like the get guided by the weak aura type stuff that you have to deal with. The menagerie boss and the first boss also feel very similar to what we had before without any sort of major changes. And it really feels like at the moment, I don't want to advocate for more insanity in dungeons, especially after I just told you guys about Halls of Atonement, but it really feels like you could get away without a healer in a lot of key levels, like probably like 12 or 15s or something like that with Streets. If you have people who know what they're doing, or you have some like off healing or something, if you have like a prop alley meta or something returning, it feels like you don't really need a healer in a large amount of those areas. Definitely for the postmaster, unless your group is insane. But other swaths of the dungeon, I mean, you could just set up like a high damage spec as a healer and just blast with how it's tuned at the moment. Gambit's kind of similar, but it gets more deadly as the dungeon progresses. The very beginning of the dungeon, it's all fun and games, really. A lot of Murloc pulls. They will drop this fish stick that'll start healing the Murlocs. If they're close by, the tank just kites them away. You keep on kiting, you kill the Murlocs, you have a great time. Having, what is it, Ursul's Vortex to make sure the ads don't run away, because they'll eventually run in fear, is always super important. Having some more grips. Rest in peace, A-Bomb Limb, because that would have been really helpful for this area as well. Once you keep all the ads in together, they usually melt pretty quickly. The first boss, if you only experienced Gambit when it first came out, you had to have somebody click a console on that boss and then tell everybody where to go. Well, they changed that in Shadowlands. I think it was like the end of Shadowlands, so that all you have to do is click the console and then everybody can see the colors. You find out where the colors need to be positioned on the side consoles, and then you're going to be good to go. Going into the second boss, having to fight the pirate dragon, this one they did make some changes to. There is a ramping dot, and there's 2 magical debuffs that go out. And it's a ramping dot that when you dispel it, it also deals a big amount of AoE damage. So this is also really insane. It makes the fight super hard because all the healer can really focus on is dispelling, topping everyone off. You have about 5 or 6 seconds after you dispel and top everybody to get your next dispel, top everybody once again, and then 8 seconds later, your dispel comes off cooldown, and what do you know? Another round of magic dispels are going out. There's really no winning. There's really no getting ahead of these magic dots. They're way too high damage, and they are very overtuned, and it makes it so the healer can only really focus on just trying to keep health bars alive. And so if the tank or DPS are not working on getting any of the sailors pushed into the boss's frontal, you are going to have a hellish time on this boss. So a lot of pressure on the healer and a lot of pressure on the entire group to make sure you're dealing with these pirates to get them killed off quickly, effectively. And if you don't, you basically just insta-wipe. The boss goes like 0 to 100 incredibly quickly. They did add some more indicators, specifically for when you were getting some of like the sword throws that go out into players. Those big red circles that you see on people deal a ton of damage, so you want to make sure you're not standing in them or not stacking them on top of other people. The end of the dungeon is actually where you have a lot more danger from trash, and this is where you have casters that'll heal themselves with Revitalize, cast bolts, and then periodically cast an unstable rift, which will wipe the group if the cast goes off. Very strange to keep that much caster junk, I guess you could call it, in the final boss room instead of kind of toning some of those things down, especially after all the issues we had in like Grim Batol earlier this expansion. I really wish that they would tone this area down and kind of address it a little bit better. I do like that they've still kept the like solar sparks that are spawned by some of the like lieutenants at the very end. You spawn this orb and you basically have to kill it off as it radiates damage. Those are always kind of cool, and I don't really mind those because, especially as a healer, if you have some single target damage to laser them down, that can actually be more effective than trying to heal through them. The final boss is really just a similar like web of mechanics, having to drag in ads, get them kicked, AoE them down, making sure you're drawing like the lines so that you're able to break the stars that are putting up a shield onto the boss. Lots of dodging for the swirlies that are going to be going out. It becomes quite a mess very quickly, but it's still like a very fun and like epic looking encounter. So Tazvesh is fun, but I think in general, both of these dungeons are very imbalanced, with some areas that are super tough and some areas that it feels like there's not really much of anything going on besides just mass AoEing a bunch of zombie mobs down. So I know a lot of the Shadowlands dungeons didn't do a fantastic job of like consistently challenging the healer with damage mechanics. And I think there was a lot of dungeons in the Shadowlands pool that were like, hey, if you kick, you have like almost no damage, so go bring a healer that does the most DPS. This was a direct reason that we saw like Mists, when it came back into the dungeon pool in season 1, actually got a lot of buffs and was made much harder because they realized there was not that much reliable, unavoidable AoE that's happening. What I'm kind of worried about in this dungeon pool, they've almost forgotten, I would argue. They've almost forgotten about what it was like having to deal with this mass AoE, and they're like, oh, well, like they have bolts, like let's just keep those mechanics. People like those dungeons back in the day, let's just keep all these kicks. And I feel like it's just the wrong direction to kind of go into. Priory as well, it seems like they didn't really learn a lot from the struggles of Priory, and the things that would actually kill people are these instant 100-0 type damage events or combo damage events where bolts go off at the same time an unavoidable hit goes off, and it's very, very difficult, especially when you're in a pug group, to keep everybody alive when most people don't use defensives until it's almost too late. And when it's only one big mass AoE event, it makes it super, super difficult to survive. And I think they actually ironically did the right thing in Ara-Kara, making the beetles do dot damage and do very big visual AoEs for when they're going to do it, so it's actually easier to prepare. So I don't know if it's different people working on the design at Blizzard, but I wish they would do more of Ara-Kara, where it's well projected, it maybe even ramping damage or just consistent damage or pulsing damage, not these like big AoE explosions that 100-0 players. I think we've seen plenty of those over the years, and I would really love to have a season where those are tuned to a minimum, rather than having them in almost every dungeon, which helps encourage a disc meta. And it could still happen even if there was rot damage, but it certainly becomes more likely that absorbs have higher value when, if you increase the effective health, there's a greater chance people don't die to these one-shots or these near one-shot type effects. So that's been my experience so far on PTR. My bonus final note is they also did not like and subscribe to this video, and I would really encourage you guys to do that. But also, they made changes to PTR where they gave everyone like maxed out avoidance gear, and I am turbo concerned that that is going to result in bad things happening to the tuning of the dungeons. I think they're going to not realize that people are not dying to these AoE events because they have 20% damage reduction for every AoE hit. And then people are going to go walk into the 8s and 10s at the beginning of a season and just get obliterated. So there's my key warning for you guys. Keep an eye out for it. Big love to our patrons for making all this content possible. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys found it helpful and useful, and I'll catch y'all next time.